Welcome in to Vol Basketball Fever, your number one source for discussions about the Vols and Lady Vols basketball programs. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a video, and check in every week for new episodes of the show, video breakdowns, and more. Now, on with the episode. Hello everyone, and welcome into another episode of the Vol Basketball Fever podcast. I am Nathanael Rutherford, joined by a special guest this week. If you've been a longtime listener of the show here, or even remember my days back at Rocky Top Insider, you know who this is. He's been on the RTI podcast before. He was on here when we had the SEC podcast. It is Erik Haslam of Haslametrics to talk about Tennessee basketball and their upcoming, chances in the NCAA tournament, the SEC and the NCAA tournament, just kind of NCAA tournament stuff at large. So Erik, thank you so much for coming on with me.
Hey, thanks for having me again. It's great.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. It's that time of year. I don't care what the song says. I don't care what other people say. The most wonderful time of the year to me is March. So I am very excited for March Madness to be here. So again, thank you for coming on here. Before we get into it, again, thank all of you who are watching/listening to this episode. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. We're available everywhere you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, you name it, we're there. And subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching this, and give this video a like and share it. We'd appreciate it. And also go check out Erik's website at haslametrics.com. But there'll be a link to it here in the description on the YouTube video and a link on the podcast description as well. Before we get into some of the topics and questions I had for you, Erik, you kind of described, I've referenced your stuff multiple times here on the show on a couple of the matchup breakdown videos I've done for Tennessee this season, because I really like your work and like the analytics you do. And also you're a pretty approachable person on Twitter and actually will, interact with people and answer questions and stuff. So I've always been very appreciative of that. But I guess for those who may not know, let our listeners know, what Haslametrics is, what kind of differentiates it between some of the other analytical sites, and kind of, how long you've been doing it and stuff too.
Yeah, see, I was a huge fan of March Madness. Fell in love with March Madness in the early '90s, back with that Loyola Marymount team with Hank Gathers and Bo Kimball and all that. And I just, right around 90, 91, right around there is when I just, like I said, fell in love with March Madness. First thing I would do every the day after Selection Sunday was run to the newspaper stand and get that USA Today, because that was the only way you could actually get those team capsules back then. We didn't have all these ESPNs and Fox Sports and all these other channels. You kind of had to rely on one or two stations unless you were watching something like on CBS, maybe NBC, or might have a game or an ABC. But it was just something that I just kind of had a passion for. And I remember even back in the 90s trying to break down the numbers even before the age of the internet, and really not doing all that well. But, later on, all of a sudden we had all this information at our fingertips, and I had the background. I'm an engineer by trade, and I have a pretty big coding background. So I started tinkering with this about 10, 12 years ago. Simple stuff, spreadsheets, Microsoft Access databases, things like that. And I found that I was kind of recreating the wheel, and I kind of recreated the wheel based on Dean Oliver's 4 factors. And, after doing it that way, I kind of learned a little bit about statistics, taught myself things about statistics that I didn't really had not learned in college. And then I kind of took a step back and I said, you know what, this is not the way I want to do that. I don't want to recreate someone else's wheel. I want to create my own wheel. And so that's when I invented Haslametrics. And I said, well, if I was going to erase my memory, just start from scratch and do it my own way, how would I do it? And I really kind of decided to do things, based on scoring and shooting situations. So you're thinking of, where are you shooting from? Are you shooting from behind the 3-point line, inside the 3-point line, from what I call near proximity locations, dunks, tip-ins, alley-oops, things like that. Also, think of situational shot data. Like if you can get situations where a team gets an offensive rebound and a quick putback, that yields a higher percentage. If you get a quick steal and score quickly off that steal, that yields a higher percentage. I started kind of isolating all of these shot locations and all these situations down. And then I kind of built my model based on that. And, in order to do that, I decided to use play-by-play data. Up until then, I don't think a lot of people were doing that. But the play-by-play data was really rich compared to the box score data. It allowed me to do a couple things. It really allowed me to differentiate between those mid-range twos and those up-close twos. So that's where I broke things down with near proximity and mid-range originally. And then the other thing, and anybody who knows me on Twitter has seen me go #analytically final. I do that like crazy. For whatever reason, people love that. It's something that I took from what was it? Mike James, I think was his name, who created an algorithm to kind of determine when a game was going to be over. And I kind of tweaked it a little bit. I thought his was a little too aggressive. I backed it off, made a little tweak there. And what happens is when I get to a point in a game where it's mathematically over or analytically final, I take everything after that point and I throw it on the trash heap because I want to see these teams when they're playing full strength. And, all this stuff, if you have a 22-point lead with 4 minutes to go and all of a sudden the lead is 8 at the end, that's not truly indicative of that team if they took their foot off the gas. So little things like that I built into my model. And right around the year 2014, I ended up creating the website, just had ratings at first, and then I kind of built onto it little by little. There was, doing the game projections, doing the automated team summaries, the automated game previews, the bracketology deserves, things like that. I just kind of built on over time. And, when your passion is, and it is something like that, you kind of just keep working at it. And over the years, it's just kind of developed into what it is today.
Wow, thank you. I just realized I'd never actually heard your full story about how you created it. I think I'd asked you different things about your process, but never heard the full story. So that was pretty awesome. I can relate to growing up and rushing like the day after Selection Sunday, getting the newspaper. It was the Knoxville News Sentinel here in Knoxville, which is now part of the USA Today Family Network, whatever. But and getting the paper and cutting out the bracket for the paper to like writing my picks and things like that. And like you said, getting little team capsules in there too, because even back then, like in the early 2000s, like there wasn't, definitely not like to the extent we have now with the breakdowns on ESPN and all the websites and stuff that have breakdowns of teams. So yeah, I can relate to having that obsession as a kid growing up and getting the paper and looking over the stuff and poring over it and being just super excited for March. So I'm right there with you, Erik, on that one. So yeah, let's dive into some Tennessee talk here, to some SEC talk and just NCAA at large here. So looking at Tennessee right now, looking at haslammetrics.com, I may, hopefully if I remember in editing, go in here and flash this up on the screen to look at the web page, the homepage for Haslammetrics and kind of show what I'm talking about here. But Tennessee right now slated, they're number 14 in your rankings. They're in as a 3 seed. They are, however, I think like the last number 3 seed on there technically. So I think this kind of, I beforehand I sent you some questions over, and this kind of answers one of them about whether or not Tennessee's locked into the 3 seed. Obviously, I think if Tennessee does go one and done in the SEC tournament, they'll slip to a 4 seed because that would be probably a bad loss to either South Carolina or Mississippi State. But I'm curious, Tennessee right now in the 3 seed, you have, as of right now, this is before the major conference tournament start, you have Villanova, Texas Tech, and Wisconsin as the other 3 seeds. And as a 2 seed, you have Kansas, Kentucky, Purdue, and Duke. Is there a way, Erik, where Tennessee could play themselves into a 2 seed? If they go and win the SEC tournament, which they haven't done since 1979, so I'm not counting on that happening. But if they go and win the SEC tournament or even get to the finals and play a competitive game against at Auburn, for example, is there a chance that Tennessee gets into that 2 seed territory? And according to your bracketology deserves in your mind, and just in your opinion, or are they going to is that all that needs to happen? Or are they going to need a Duke or Purdue, or obviously they beat Kentucky and Kentucky won't make it to the finals? So are they going to need some help, in other words, to get to a potential 2 seed, even if they win the SEC tournament? Or is winning the tournament, in your opinion, enough to kind of launch them into that 2 seed discussion?
My guess is they feel like a 3 seed to me. I think they're going to remain there. I think because they're on the bottom half of that 3 line, the most likely movement is down, not up. Now, that's not to say that they could, if they run the table and they win the SEC tournament, they're probably going to have, a claim for the overall, one of the overall 2 seeds. But I think the problem with it is that the committee, for the most part, based on the conversations that I've had with people who may be in that committee room, a lot of the seeding is already done by the time Tennessee is actually going to have their first tip of the SEC tournament. They've kind of slotted them. And I think they really look at the situation like, these teams have played each other before. The season is so long. These games are not going to make a whole lot of difference because everything is kind of set in stone already. So I think if Tennessee lost that opening game, they might be in danger of dropping to a 4. If they run the table, maybe they could get there. The bracketology deserves that you see on my website are not attempting to predict the committee. They're basically using the same kind of mentality the committee would use, but it uses my metrics and not the official metrics that are on the team sheets for the NCAA selection committee. So you may see my deserves based if Tennessee ends up beating Kentucky and Auburn, Yeah, that's going to really launch them, might launch them to the 2 line on my bracketology deserves. But like I said, I think the committee kind of makes their decision already by Thursday or Friday. So by the time Tennessee tips, I think they're already going to slot Tennessee. And what they typically do is they'll scrub the lines later on. They'll probably slot them there, and then they look at the results maybe a little bit later on, maybe Saturday, and say, well, let's move them up 1, let's move them up 2. Maybe they're the number 12 or 13 overall or something like that. And then if they do really well, they may move them up 1 or maybe move them up 2. Not an entire seed line necessarily, but within that seed itself. I in my opinion, I don't think Tennessee is going to get to that 2 line. I may be surprised, but based on the behavior that I've seen in the past from the committee, these big conference tournaments don't really mean much for teams like Tennessee, Kentucky, Auburn, Alabama. They're already in the dance. They've kind of slotted them already. This is really for those teams on the outside looking in. And, like I said, you may get some scrubbing going on. I think the committee even mentioned that if you had like a Purdue at the bottom of the 2 line and a Wisconsin at the top of the 3, they'd probably swap them because Wisconsin has a season sweep on Purdue. So a situation like that, where they'll do that kind of scrubbing. But other than that, I really feel like Tennessee is as much of a 3 seed as a 3 seed you're going to find. I think they're kind of right there with Texas Tech as 2 3 seeds. Not to say it's impossible that they can go down or climb up, but I just think that there's a high percentage they're both landing on the 3 line.
That was some really good insight, Eric. That was some really good insight into the way the committee thinks, because I've not heard that before about, at least me personally. Maybe I just haven't listened to the right people, but I've not heard about that before, about the way they kind of have it basically more or less like with those top teams kind of slotted in already before we get really too deep into the conference tournaments. I think it's interesting. Do you? We're not. This is something I asked you beforehand. But do you agree with that reasoning? Do you agree with that logic that the committee has of kind of already having those teams slotted in?
No, not necessarily. I look at things a little bit differently, and it's a little bit frustrating for me. And every year I try to, the bracketology deserves. I'd love to be able to predict this perfectly, but the fact of the matter is I'm using my metrics and they're using different metrics. And sometimes I look at the metrics that they're using, particularly the BPI, and go, where are they? How do they land on this? But they chose the BPI for a reason. Cough, cough, ESPN, cough. So they're going to use what they're going to use. And what I found with bracketologists is and I probably do this myself, they form their own narratives on teams based on what they see with their eyes. And they argue in favor of those narratives until the cows come home. That's just the way they do it. And having an argument with a bracketologist is like arguing with a basketball official. You're always going to be wrong, compared to them. So it's frustrating because I can make arguments and people will always find some, well, look at this game and they beat this team. Okay, fine. I'm not going to convince you. It's a pointless argument. I guess that's what makes bracketology kind of fun for a lot of people. I think they like the different viewpoints, and you have the bracket matrix where you have 100 plus different bracketologists out there trying, and they average them all out. It's kind of interesting, but no, it's, I look at this and from a committee standpoint, I would include every game. I think every game matters. I think if Tennessee beats a Kentucky and beats an Auburn back to back, that should count. Those are big wins. Those are quadrant 1A wins. Why would you not count them? But from what I've gathered, the committee largely has everything kind of slotted in place before that happens. And maybe they'll prove me wrong. I mean, what would happen if Tennessee wins those 2 games and ends up the number 6 overall seed and the second highest 2 seed? It could happen. I'd be surprised, but I've seen things before where teams have done really well in a postseason power conference tournament, and then you look at it and go, they seeded them there. But I've seen it too many times, so it's almost like they seed them before that tournament starts, and then you might see them shift a little bit, but it's really not that much. Okay,
yeah, that's kind of the way I was leaning too. So I was curious your thoughts on it, but I'm with you. Like I think having to slot it in like that is, I wouldn't say silly, but yeah, I agree with you. I think that they should be a little more flexible with their I guess viewpoint here in the last week or so, because you're right, like their quality wins and their neutral site, which has been, to me, that's going to be the interesting thing with the SEC tournament. We may get to some of that in a second. Like the SEC, especially with the top 4, if you want to include Alabama, 2 top 5 in the SEC this year, has been so home court dominated, where the top four, especially I think combined, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Auburn had one loss at home this year. So like that's been so home court dominated that the neutral site's going to be a big equalizer that, I think those should count, pretty significantly, especially this year when you're playing in Tampa Bay of all places, which is no SEC teams even are close to that. So I don't know what they're doing there, but
I think part of the problem is that selection show is right after these championships, and the committee would argue, and they'd have a point in saying, well, if you're talking about a Tennessee who's in the middle of the 2 line, all of a sudden they win a big game and it bumps them to the 1 line. We have certain rules where, okay, we can't play it in this particular pod. We can't match them up with a team they've played before. We can't match them up with a conference, someone else from your same conference. And it may cause problems, and that's going to be their argument, saying it's too last minute for us to make that switch. They basically create a cutoff, which in my opinion is Thursday or Friday, probably the end of the day Thursday. And my guess is by the time Tennessee tips on Friday, they're already going to be slotted by the committee somewhere. And it's just going to be and I'm guessing it's going to be the 3 line. And I think if they lose their opening round game, maybe they fall to a 4, but it's a tough task to get them up to the 2 line. I just don't think they're going to land there. I think they're going to be a 3.
That's fair, because I agree with you. I think from everything I've seen from Tennessee this year, but especially how they've kind of played the last month, where they've gotten better, in my opinion, and have found a little bit more of a groove. I agree with you. I think they're a solid 3 seed, but I think you can make an argument for a 4. But I'm with you. Even if they win out in the SEC tournament, it would be tough to push them to a 2. But I mean, me personally, with the orange colored glasses I'm going to wear right now, like I could make an argument for it, but I could also like take those glasses off. I could see an argument against it, because you look at who a lot of the other 2 seeds are that are being projected, and I could see arguments for them just saying that, hey, they're just better overall teams in Tennessee this year and have been more consistent. And I would say, okay, you're right.
And who from a 4 line would, when you look at the 4 line, Providence, you're going to move Providence up, you're going to move Illinois up, you're going to move UCLA up. I don't know. I just think that Tennessee's got those teams beat. Again, if you have a team like a UCLA that wins the whole Pac-12 tournament and Tennessee fares poorly, they could land on the 4 line. Like I said, I think it's more likely that Tennessee would screw up and land on the 4 line than it is to climb. I think they got to really score some big wins to get to the 2 line, and even then, it's questionable.
Yeah, you'd likely need, if that was the case, you'd need someone like a Duke or Purdue to lose in their first game of their tournament. But even then, like you said, that's not. You'd be more likely to move up maybe a Villanova or somebody into that 2 line rather than Tennessee. So yeah, I think you're right. I think 3 maybe where Tennessee is slotted in, which that's fine. You get some pretty interesting matchups as a 3 seed, and it's not and you're still at the bottom part of the bracket, so you're not matched up with the 1, before you get to the Elite 8. So I think that's I like that. I think 3 is fine with me. I'm fine with it. I think Vol fans would be fine with it too. But speaking of Tennessee, we've just kind of talked a little bit about it. Was curious your kind of postseason outlook or forecast for Tennessee, in your opinion, looking at their analytical makeup. Do they have the kind of makeup or the numbers and stuff for a team that can make a type of deep run? Because I look at, me personally watching them this year and also keeping up with the numbers on your site and on KenPom and different sites too. Team rankings is one I look at too. This team has been, especially the first 2.5 months, and it's reflected on that all play percentages on Haslametrics here, very up and down. Maybe it's a little, I guess maybe exaggerated because it's broken down into the bars are by 5s rather than like by 10s or 15s. But still, you go from a preseason right outside the top 15 to a team that within the first month had already dropped down to barely inside the top 25. But again, if I remember to put this in editing, I'll go and show people here what I'm talking about. But you can see on the graph, there's a lot of up and down for the first 2.5 months. And by the time you get to late January, going back into February, there's a couple dips here and there, but for the most part, it's kind of evened out a little bit, and it's kind of doing a little bit more of just kind of a even keel thing for Tennessee's rankings, more so than it has at any point this season. So all that to get to the point of me saying this, their consistency is ranked pretty low on Haslametrics. Their momentum's not super high, but you look at their strength of schedule, they've had one of the toughest strength of schedules of the entire season. I looked up data on KenPom and on, I think, Sports Reference as well, and looked back at like the last 20 years, or I think 25 years of Tennessee basketball to see where this year's strength of schedule rankings on both of those sites, compared to the last 20 years. And this is the toughest strength of schedule Tennessee has had since the 01-02 team. So like it's been a really tough team, because I look at your bracketology deserves and also other sites, the top 16 teams on there, Tennessee played Arizona and beat Arizona. They played Auburn and beat Auburn. They played Kentucky and split that series. They played Villanova and lost to them. They played Texas Tech and lost to them. And those are all teams like in that 1, 2, and 3 seed category. So all that to get to this, Tennessee's not been great away from home either, because looking at their rankings, they're 337th away from home. But again, that could be said for probably Auburn and Arkansas and Kentucky in the SEC. So I'm curious, just taking all that information, packaging it up. You mentioned you're not as big into the predictive stuff as it is just kind of analyzing, but what is your kind of analysis on Tennessee heading into, here in postseason play?
Yeah, well, like that away from home you talked about, that's, that is almost like a testament to how much of a home court advantage you have as well. So I always think of a team like a Rutgers or something like that. So a team that always performs really, really well on their home, it's going to make your away and your neutral court games look a lot worse. So sometimes that could be a little bit misleading. I always kind of say this with the metrics. I always take everything with the metrics with a little bit of a grain of salt, because there is always a story to tell. And it's a reason why I'm never a big supporter in ever getting rid of the eye test. Because, the metrics can be manipulated. The metrics, you can cherry pick the metrics. And there's always a story. So I always say that the metrics are always kind of like a evidence of the crime scene. It's not an open and shut case. You got to use it. You got to have a judge and jury using your eyes. So I always kind of put it that way. But from a standpoint of a perspective of the outlook for Tennessee, I always, in my opinion, the teams that do the best in the postseason really kind of have four things. You want to have upperclassmen leadership. You want to have depth, you want to have shooting ability, and you want to have balance. And if you look at this for Tennessee, if you're looking at the upperclassmen leadership, you have a mixture in there. You have Vescovy, you have James, Fulkerson, Plopchich. All those guys have the experience. So that's, you mix in some younger guys as well, but it's adequate. From a depth standpoint, I think you could probably argue that they're 9 deep right now with Tennessee. With the loss of Kamwa, I think you probably went 10 deep before that. Definitely you're fine there. If you're looking at shooting ability, I always kind of say that's kind of a question mark. I look at 3-point percentage, and adjusted 3-point percentage, they're 64th in the country. That's good. It's good. Not necessarily elite. And I know that Vescovy's shooting 40%. I think a couple guys are in the 35 range, but it's I wouldn't say it's great, but it's really, really good. So they're fine. And then balance, I go maybe a little bit more of a question mark there as well. The defense is great. I have them rated 3rd in defensive efficiency. Offensive efficiency is 51st. And, I think, I think 51st isn't that bad. It's not, I've seen it more egregious imbalances. Definitely there are more egregious ones out there, but I always make the argument that, your D can be as great as ever. At some point, there are going to be games when you got to put the ball in the hole as well. And that's, it goes both ways. There's sometimes great offenses who at some point those shots aren't going to go down. You got to play some defense as well. And, a team I think of in that situation was Ohio State last year. Ohio State was really great offensively, but defensively they were atrocious. And what happened to them? They got beat in the first round by Oral Roberts. And I'll give you a little hint. This year they're worse. They're worse defensively, and much worse. Wow. Ohio State is. So keep that in mind. Defensively, they're terrible. I thought they were bad last year. They're worse this year. But one of the things about Tennessee, though, is we talked about consistency. And one of the problems with Tennessee being 318th in consistency is that means you kind of can jump all over the board. And when you're looking at consistency, you're not just looking at the game result. I always tell people and say, if a game projection is Tennessee's supposed to win 60-55 and they win 90-85, the margin is still 5, but the inconsistency is still there because they scored far more than expected. They gave up far more than expected. Now, pace can play a part in that. You still have to look at the pace and break down the efficiency. But even when you do that, Tennessee has that 318th ranking. It's not as bad as North Carolina or Villanova or Rutgers or Iowa. It's kind of funny that, that those a couple teams show up there, because you notice that North Carolina and Villanova show up there who played Tennessee. And you kind of wonder if maybe, again, you got to look into the metrics a little bit more. Did teams like that who are very, very inconsistent, did they pull Tennessee down with them to a certain degree? I think it probably plays a little bit of a part. I think there's still some inconsistency there with Tennessee, but I have a little bit of a problem trusting teams that are inconsistent, because they can bring it one day. And I'm thinking the team that jumps to mind is North Carolina.
Yep.
When North Carolina brings it, they can play with anybody. But you've seen so many games that are head scratchers and like, what is going on with this team? I mean, they lost a Pitt for Christ's sake. I mean, that should tell you something. And Pitt's terrible. You saw what happened with Pitt today with Boston College. They lost by 24 in the ACC tournament. How that team ever beat North Carolina is a mystery to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. And man, just hearing you talk about this stuff, I had so many questions popped in my mind. I could sit here and talk with you for hours about analytics stuff, Erik, but I know you have things to get to do. And also, I don't think our listeners want to sit there for 2 or 3 hours and just listen to us talk about that. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the breakdown of the consistency and how that can, again, I agree with you. As much as I love numbers and analytics and stuff, I agree with you, like they can be skewed. And which is why I also agree with you in the fact that I don't think the committee should ever fully do away with eye test. I think you can maybe, devalue it some, but I think you should always have that kind of human element / eye test, whatever you want to call it, in there for selections and stuff, because you're right. Like sometimes the analytics can be misleading. Sometimes they can be, they can be skewed. They can be purposely, manipulated for different things as well. So I agree with you. I think that while sometimes you look at the analytics and go, well, this team doesn't, they have no business doing this, they have no business doing that, and then they go out in the court and prove you wrong. It's because, again, they may not tell the whole story. They tell a lot of the story, and I like them, and I think they're a great foundation to kind of, base arguments and things on. But that's why they go play the games, man. Like that's what you talk about, that's why betting exists. That's why, just because you have somebody beat on paper doesn't mean you beat them on the court. So,
and injuries happen. That's a big part of it. And I don't know if you remember back, what was it, late '90s with Kenyon Martin with Cincinnati. He was the heart and soul of that team. I mean, think of it now with a guy like Keegan Murray with Iowa, Johnny Davis with Wisconsin. Any of these guys go down with a major injury, it completely changes the outlook of these teams. Cincinnati, it was a big one back then. And they were going to be a number 1 seed. And they lost Kenyon Martin to like a broken leg or something like that. And the committee actually stashed him as a 2, despite having a resume of a 1, just because they looked at it and said, we can't, with a straight face, say that Cincinnati is a 1 anymore. They're just not. And a lot of people would say, well, but they earned it. They should be rewarded for their resume. But you're like, but there's the other side of the coin where people are going to say, yeah, but if you're an 8-9 who gets to face that number 1 seed, you have far more of an advantage over every other 8-9 in that bracket. So you got to, it's a double-edged sword. You're never going to win this argument. The committee is going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to shrug and go, whatever. And I guess I'm okay with it.
Hey, sports are subjective. I mean, like this is what's great about it. You can make arguments for both sides on a lot of different things. So looking kind of a little bit broader here, and about the SEC, but also I guess kind of still talking about Tennessee here a little bit, just because we're talking SEC. Looking at right now, again on your deserves right now, you have Auburn as the last number 1 seed. You have Kentucky as the second number 2 seed. And I've seen a lot of different things have Auburn as a high 2 seed, a low 1 seed, and Kentucky as maybe even the number 1 overall 2 seed, or however you want to word that, the number 5 team, I guess, in the rankings. What are in your estimation, like what are the odds that the SEC is able to get actually 2 number 1 seeds? Would it come down to just having Auburn and Kentucky play in that title game, or would you have to have a little bit of help? Would you have to have maybe like a Arizona not win their tournament, a Baylor lose, or maybe a Kansas lose early? Would it be just as simple as, okay, if Auburn and Kentucky both make it to the title? And again, I know this goes back to the conversation we had earlier about the committee cutting things off on a Thursday night, but in just your opinion, getting those 2 teams in the finals and it being a competitive game and it being, coming down to the last minute, in your opinion, should that be enough to elevate maybe both those teams to number 1 seed? Because there was a time this year, I think in mid-February, where a lot of bracketologists and stuff, and thinking of Joe Lunardi, for example, because this Tennessee was on ESPN a couple times, seeing Auburn and Kentucky both slotted as number 1 seeds. So is there even a chance that could happen? Because I think personally it's a very low chance, but I think there's maybe a tiny chance that happens.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I don't see it. I think right now you have Auburn at the bottom of the 1 seeds. You have Kentucky largely in the top half of the 2s. In my opinion, Gonzaga and Baylor and even Arizona seem really locked in. I mean, maybe those guys completely blow up in the tournament, something like Arizona, especially.
I'd be stunned.
I mean, I don't see it, but I think if Arizona wins 1 game, they're a 1 seed. I think if Baylor wins 1, I mean, even Baylor probably doesn't even have to win 1 game, to be honest with you. Same thing with Gonzaga. well, obviously Gonzaga's. I mean, it doesn't matter at this point for Gonzaga. They're already in the championship tonight, so they were locked in on the one line. There's no way that they're coming off that one line. And I think that Baylor and Arizona are probably there too. So at that point, if you have those three teams locked in, you're only leaving room for one more. And I mean, the only other way you might be able to pull it off, say like I don't know. I was going to say if another Big 12 team knocked off Baylor early, but even then, I don't think it's possible. I think I guess the better question would be: is there a possibility that 0 SEC teams get on the one line? And that's a possibility. What happens if Kansas runs the table in the Big 12 tournament and Auburn and Kentucky don't perform all that well? Mm-hmm. Maybe even a Duke, could they possibly steal that? I don't think they'd get up that high. I think it's going to be Kansas and Kentucky are probably on the outside looking in right now, with Gonzaga, Baylor, Arizona, and Auburn on the inside. I think you're probably looking at 6 teams in the running for that number 1 seed. But my guess is, if I had the gun to my head, I would probably say it's going to be one SEC team. It's going to be either Auburn or it's going to be Kentucky, probably with that last number 1 seed. Maybe the third number 1 seed if Arizona, for whatever reason, doesn't get any love from the committee.
Okay, I like that, and I'd agree with that. I think there's a better chance, like a much better chance, honestly, of there being no number 1 SEC seed as opposed to 2. So I'd agree with you on that one. Looking at like just the SEC in general this year, I think I know the answer to this question. I think I at least know the answer to one of these questions. I'm curious, based off of, if I don't expect you to remember every 1 through 353 of your, or 358 of your rankings, before the season began, but from what you can remember of kind of like preseason projections on teams and what your thoughts were on some of the SEC teams, who, according to your analytics, or just even your opinion and just your specific opinion, which SEC team was this season the most disappointing in terms of, they're projected to go high, they're projected to be much better than they were, and they dropped off and are nowhere near what they kind of expected. And then who in your opinion has been kind of the biggest surprise and a positive aspect of a team that weren't expecting a whole lot of, and now suddenly they've played a lot better above their I guess maybe preseason projection and your analytics.
Well, as luck would have it, I actually was able to perform a query and pull out the comparison of the preseason rankings and the current day rankings. So I can tell you the most disappointing team the 2 most disappointing teams are very, very disappointing teams. The first one was Missouri. Missouri came into the season in our preseason baselines ranked 83rd in the country. They're currently 161st, a drop of 78 spots. Again, the preseason baselines take a lot of factors into play, and part of it is looking at starting with last year's data and then looking at 3 years of prestige as well, and then kind of looking at who's coming in. I'm taking in factors like transfers and incoming freshmen and how many returning minutes, returning players, coaching changes, things like that all come into play. So sometimes you see a team where you kind of look and say the bottom might fall out, but it's the analytics are going to be a little bit slow to allow it to happen, because you're like, how far can they truly fall in 1 year? Well, Missouri fell pretty far in 1 year. They fell 78 spots from the start of the year. The other one is not a big surprise either. That's Georgia. And that's pretty sad, actually, considering their preseason baseline was 140. I
was about to say, that's pretty bad when they were – I already expected them to be the worst in the SEC, and that they even underperformed that. Wow.
Yeah. They came into the season ranked dead last in the SEC at number 140. They're 193 right now, so they fell 53 spots. Flip the coin. The team that actually jumped the most from the preseason was actually Texas A&M. And Texas A&M had a few tough years. They came into the season ranked 123rd. They're currently 64th, a rise of 59 spots. They were, in the last 3 years coming into this season, they were 99th, 103rd, and 157th at the end of the last 3 seasons. This is their first 20-win season since 17-18. So they were a rise of 59. The other one is not a huge surprise. It's Auburn. Auburn came in the season. A lot of people didn't expect Auburn to do what they were doing. They thought they were a good team. They didn't think they were this good. They came in the season ranked number 41 for me. They're currently number 11, a rise of 30 spots in the year. So yeah, Texas A&M and Auburn are the top 2 that are I wouldn't say biggest surprises, just the pleasant surprises of the SEC.
So I was wrong about the 2 worst, but I was right about Auburn being one of the biggest positive surprises, because I remember looking recently, I can't remember why, but looking recently at their profile on your site and seeing that they were in the 40s at the beginning of the year. I was like, well, they way overperformed, because I forgot that, like, you're right, like we they did not have a great year last year, and they lost a couple of key pieces there. And while they added Jabari Smith and Walker Kessler, people didn't know what to expect from Walker Kessler because it's not like he didn't play a ton at UNC. So you thought, okay, he'll be probably good, but I didn't expect him to go be getting a bunch of double doubles and triple double blocks.
A defensive juggernaut, yeah.
Right, yeah, and I think we all expected Jabari Smith to be really good, but not to the level that he was. And then also for them to that kind of pick up the slack for a lot of the other players on Auburn's team and kind of raise the whole like all the boats raising the whatever high tide raises for all ships. Like that's kind of what they did for Auburn there. So I think you're right, and for whatever reason, like it did not dawn on me that. Until you just said it, that Texas A&M had a 21 season this year until just now. I knew they had improved as the year went along, but man, I just didn't realize they went 20-11 in the regular season. Wow.
There's some bracketologists who kind of have them in it's a real long shot of being in the conversation. I don't think they have enough to get there, but I mean, credit to Buzz Williams. It's a team that it's really struggled for a lot of years and kind of turned it around this year. I mean, to be ranked in the top 65, considering that team, how bad that team was, I want to say 2 years ago, they were like number 275 for me at one point. They were hideously atrocious 2 years ago, early in the season. Then they kind of got their act together, but they've never done as well as they have that they're doing right now since, like I said, 2017-18. So yeah, I think they might have a bright future ahead of them.
Yeah, they were one of the 5 SEC teams to finish the year tied at 9-9 in the SEC. So that even further solidified things that my co-host and I, Gene, have talked about in this podcast this year, that the SEC overall has gotten like depth-wise it's better than it has been, especially in many, many years past. But it really is, there's just a huge separation between the top 4 and the rest. Like I would be absolutely stunned if we don't have chalk going into the SEC tournament semifinals on Saturday, where it's, Auburn, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas. Like if one of those other teams upsets one of those other two, I would be pretty floored, honestly, because there's just been such a discrepancy between the top 4 and the rest of the SEC. So that does kind of lead into the next point I kind of wanted to talk to you about the SEC is this, from what you can remember, how long you've been doing this, like having actual Haslametric stuff set up?
I think the 2014-15 season was the first year I did it. Okay. So sometime it was in February of 2015, I think, is when I kind of rolled it out. Okay,
so for the last 7 years, 6-7 years or so. So in that estimation, like from what you can remember, the last 6-7 years, basically the last half decade, in your mind, is this kind of the strongest that the SEC has been poised for multiple teams to have at NCAA tournament runs? Because obviously you look back at the year where Auburn made a Final Four run, and people weren't expecting that. But you look at that, and that was where they played Kentucky in the Elite Eight. You had 2 teams went deep. You had Tennessee make a Sweet 16 recently. You had Arkansas and Auburn both make Sweet 16 runs and do well. But to me, I look at Auburn, Kentucky, and Tennessee especially, and I'll throw in Arkansas in there too, as all 4 capable of getting to that second weekend and possibly further. I'm the least believer in Arkansas of those 4 just because they've not impressed me. I mean, I know they came back and made it a game against Tennessee at home in Knoxville, but I think that was also a lot to do with Tennessee kind of almost throwing that game away. But I think that, to me, you have at least 3 teams that are very much capable of getting to that second weekend, and again, maybe going further, especially in my opinion, in Kentucky's case with the way they've been playing lately. But is this kind of the best you've seen the SEC poised for some deep runs? Because even the teams that are on the bubble, I look at your bracketology deserves, and it was you obviously have Tennessee, Auburn, and Kentucky all up there in that top 3 seed territory. Then you go a little bit further, you have Arkansas as a 5 in the bracket deserves, Alabama as a 6, LSU as a 6, and then I think that is it in terms of teams that are actually, you have solidly in, but you have you have Florida as a team that is one of the first, I guess actually the 5th team out. You have A&M kind of right there with them too. So you have other teams that could sneak in possibly. I don't think they will, but we'll see. But that's a good solid group of teams there. That's how many did I say? 6 teams, 7 teams, 6 teams in the SEC that make it in. And I think there's a good chance that I don't know that many of them will be one and done. If I had to guess, LSU's a one and done candidate just because they've been all over the place this year, and now with this Will Wade stuff that came out not too long before you and I were starting to record, like that just seems like a big mess over there again. So my question is, does it seem like the SEC is poised to have a few deep tournament runs this year?
On paper, they are. The tournament is always a crazy place, as we saw with the Pac-12 last year. But we always got to go on paper. And looking on paper, one of the things I do is I like to come up with the conference rankings. And what I kind of do, and people are like, they argue like how you want to do conference rankings. Well, what I try to do is I take my own rankings. I take for each conference, I take the average ranking in the top 5. I take the average ranking in the middle 5, and I take the average ranking in the bottom 5. And then I take those 3 and I average those, and that's how I get to a conference ranking. I actually released this in a tweet earlier today. And if you look at the SEC right now, they're third overall. They were fourth, but they jumped into third. They passed the Big East. But they're so, as you mentioned, they're so top heavy and bottom heavy. And so if you look at the top 5, and like I said, you break it down to top and middle and bottom. If you look at the top 5, the average ranking of the top 5, SEC is number 1.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the middle 5, they're number 3, and if you look at the bottom 5, they're number 4. So they, it shows you how bad they have the worst of the worst and the best of the best. They're very bipolar in that way. And like you said, there's 5 teams that are in my top 20. There's 6 of them in my top 30. And then if you include Mississippi State and Florida, there's 8 of them in my top 50. On paper, yeah, very, very, very strong. I look at this, and this is probably the strongest SEC group that I've seen, especially when you look at that top 5. It's the best top 5 of any conference in the country based on my analytics. So, yeah, I would definitely not be surprised to see any of these teams go quite a distance. I might even disagree with you on Arkansas. Arkansas is a weird team. And I've seen it now, and we talked about the charts that I put on my website about their ranking, and both last year and this year, Arkansas started just tanked early on. And I even wrote a tweet back when they had that Texas A&M loss. I think it was in January. And I said, boy, the Muss bus needs an overhaul. And it was like, just like last year, it was like Muss flipped a switch and all of a sudden they took off. And you can see the charts from this year and last year for Arkansas where they just go skyrocket right in the middle of January. And I look at what they did last year. They got through. Then they ended up beating Texas Tech last year, I think, and I think they got to the Sweet 16. I don't know if they ended up. I forgot who they ended up losing to in the Sweet 16 or the Elite 8. But I could definitely see Arkansas being a second weekend team again.
No, I mean, actually, you may have swayed me. I'm looking at. You're absolutely right. Like I'm looking at the chart now. They were down in the maybe even the 80s on. I think like in mid January they're down in the 80s, and then they, like you said, they had a really big win, skyrocketed, and now they're up and and it just continued to kind of climb. They didn't have too many dips since then, and have climbed all the way up to a where are they right now in the all play? They are 17th, so the top 20 team. So yeah, they've climbed up a ton from the beginning of the year. And that was a team that you had, in your projections as a top 25, preseason kind of analytic team that, again, you're right. Like last year, I remember this happening last year too. We thought, well, they had a really weak non-conference schedule. They got an SEC play and we're like, okay, well, let's see what they do. They struggled. And then they, again, and I think January or early February last year, turned on a switch and all of a sudden we're playing some of the best ball of anybody in the SEC. So this is the second, and I think it's partially because you look at last year and this year both. What's been the consistency for Arkansas both those years? A lot of transfers and a lot of new faces on the team, and that takes a little bit to mesh. I mean, it's the same thing with Tennessee this year. Like they had, a transfer with Justin Powell, but they also had a lot of new guys as freshmen come in. A lot of guys who left from last year. Took them all to mesh. That's why I think they're playing better now, but they're still not playing super consistent. But they are playing better now than they were a month and a half ago. But yeah, you're right. Arkansas, maybe I'm underestimating them a little bit.
They're kind of the new Kentucky. In the last few years, I remember not necessarily this year, but in previous years, you've seen Calipari's teams really just not playing very, very good basketball in November and December. And I think this year was kind of a little bit return to normal for Kentucky. They were a little bit more consistent. But in past years, man, I've seen some really, really terrible basketball off Kentucky. Maybe Musselman is the new Kentucky now, because we've seen 2 years in a row where Arkansas inexplicably just kind of tanked for those first few months. And then all of a sudden the SEC schedule starts and they just kind of get their act together. So it would be a question. If I ever had a chance to interview Musselman, I would probably show him those two things and say, can you explain this? What's going on here? What switch do you have that you flip at some arbitrary time that changes this? And because now, granted, it is only 2 seasons, so it's not a big sample size, but it is still something that's very noticeable.
It's that old phrase of if I had a nickel for every time this happened, I'd have 2. It's weird that I'd have 2 of these. That's not many, but it's weird that I'd have 2.
Right, exactly.
Well, I think kind of the last thing here is a very even broader than even just looking at the SEC, but looking at definitely kind of NCAA as a whole. Again, we don't have, the brackets aren't set. That's why I want to bring you on here, because I think, the best time to have Erik Haslam on is in February and early March, when there's a lot up in the air and we can talk about all this analytic stuff. And I do think it's actually probably good to have you on again, like once everything's set, just because it's cool to look back and say, okay, where are the analytics right here? Where did the analytics kind of get this right, and where did the committee get it wrong, or just different things like that. But for those, we're I guess this time next week when people are listening to this, we'll have had a lot of brackets filled out already. We'll be getting ready probably for the play-in games and getting ready for the first round. So in for your experience of, as we both just talked about, we both have loved college basketball for decades and have, been big on the NCAA tournament and March Madness for most of our lives. What are some, in your experience with dealing with analytics and stuff and seeing your own trials and tribulations with picking the brackets and stuff, what's some advice you would give people who maybe, fall in love with certain numbers or things that maybe they shouldn't fall in love with? What's some advice you would give to our fellow, our fellow amateur bracketologists out there who like to fancy themselves as experts when it comes to pick'em time?
Well, I would say, first of all, don't chase every upset. If you're in some sort of bracket competition, the people who are going to probably go with a lot of chalk are probably still going to do pretty well. I mean, that's the thing. People are going to try to say, well, I nailed this 14 over a 3. Great. How far did they go? And, you may have gotten that one, but the money is down the line. So don't chase every upset. You're going to get some 12s over 5s. You're going to get some 11s over 6s. But I wouldn't go chasing the Oral Roberts games over Ohio State last year. Most people aren't going to get that right. And for every Oral Roberts, there's probably a dozen more that didn't win that game. So keep that in mind. Don't chase those upsets. I personally, I've mentioned this before, I don't necessarily trust inconsistent teams long term. If you're a team that's very up and down based on their results, I'm thinking of a team like Villanova. I've seen some really up and down results during the year. I don't know how much I'm going to trust Villanova for a team, especially teams like Iowa maybe, or even in North Carolina we talked about. Inconsistency is something I just don't go all in on North Carolina, because you've seen it too many times where the bottom just falls out. They don't show up. And so I have a hard time trusting those teams. I would say look for higher seeds. Those, if you're going to pick a 12 or even a 13, look for those favored teams that have the big weakness. I talked about Ohio State last year. Look at their offensive and defensive efficiency. If you're seeing a team with a big imbalance and all of a sudden one of their efficiencies is like Ohio State's right now, like 110th or something like that, that is a glaring weakness. That's a team that is ripe for upset. I would keep an eye on that. And then the last thing I would say is, and this is kind of an interesting little tidbit is, I would say if you're going to pick your Final Four, pick 2 number 1s, pick a number 2 or a number 3, and then pick someone else. And I'm if you say, well, why would you say that? Let's take a look at last year. Last year you had Gonzaga and Baylor, both number 1 seeds. You had Houston as a 2, and you had UCLA, the play-in team, as an 11. Go back 2019, Virginia and Michigan State. Granted, Michigan State was a 2, but Texas Tech was a 3. Auburn was a 5. You're starting to see a pattern here. 2018, Kansas and Villanova, 1s. Michigan, 3. Loyola Chicago, 11. 2017, North Carolina, Gonzaga, 1s. Oregon, 3. South Carolina, 7. So based on the pattern that I see, I think the odds are, and I've looked at this years ago, and you should probably pick 2 number 1s to go to the Final Four. That's probably going to happen. 2 are going to lose. And then who are they going to get beat by? You're probably going to get a team like a 2 or a 3 who's going to get there as well. And then the last one is kind of a crapshoot. Honestly, I mean, look at UCLA last year. I don't know why anybody would pick UCLA last year. UCLA lost their last 3 regular season games, lost their first Pac-12 tournament game to Oregon State, and then creeped back into the tournament, was down 11 points at the half to Michigan State, had to go to overtime to win that game. And then they somehow, we're a Final Four team now. I mean, that's the frustrating thing. And I think of a team like UCLA, I think a team, especially in 2017, South Carolina. So I'm like, Oh my God. If someone said back then, I'm going to pick South Carolina to go to the Final Four, I would have laughed you out of the room. I'm like, come on. Yeah, right. They're going to the Final Four. But that's always how it happens. And I wish there was a trick to determining who that 4th team is, but I haven't figured it out yet. I just know that every year there's usually one big surprise in that Final Four.
That's a very good point. Like I didn't realize it had been that consistent over the last 5-6 years, whereas basically 2 number 1s, a 2 or 3, and then a random 5 or worse seed that made it in there as well. That's interesting. And to your point about South Carolina and Frank Martin's really I got to give him credit. Like this team this year has gotten better in the last few weeks, and have been actually playing better than I expected them to over the last few weeks. But he's been riding that Final Four run for a while now at South Carolina, because that year that when they went to the Final Four, they finished 26-11, and they were pretty good that year. They went 12-6 in the SEC that year. That there wasn't a horrible team, and they were ranked at some point in that year too. But then you look at the next year, 17-16, 16-16, 18-13, 6-15, now 18-12. Like they have a chance to get to 20 wins, I guess, this year, but I mean, it'll be in the NIT, because I don't expect them to, they might win a game in the SEC, but I feel like if they play Tennessee, which would be who they'd play, I don't see them beating Tennessee. Tennessee and Rick Barnes have had really consistent success over Frank Martin, South Carolina, so I don't see that happening, and I don't see them making the NCAA tournament based off their resume. So it'd be in the NIT, but I mean, he's been riding. Kudos to Frank Martin. He's not a bad coach. He's been riding that Final Four run for several years now. If not for that, he'd been fired a couple years ago.
Same thing with Shaka Smart. Smart rode that VCU run. What did he do at Texas? Couldn't win a tournament game, and now they're talking him up. I'm not sure I'd pick Marquette in this game. I just, I could say the same thing. I'm a Wisconsin guy. Dick Bennett made a run to the Final Four in that one year in 2000. What was his record outside of that as a coach in Division I? I think he was 1-7 in the NCAA tournament if you take out that 1 year where he went to the Final Four. And so I always kind of remind people of that, mainly because I'm an up-tempo kind of guy, and I'm not big defensive. I'm much more of a Loyola Marymount kind of offense, less so a Virginia defense. I'm not that kind of guy. So when Dick Bennett was coaching here at Wisconsin, it was brutal for me to watch. And when I saw them go to the Final Four, I went, oh, God. So much more prefer the Greg Gard style than I do the Dick Bennett style. It's still not exciting, but it's, comparatively speaking, it's a lot better.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Erik, thank you so much again, man, for coming on here. Again, I mentioned at the top of the show, I'll have a link to his website in the description in both YouTube and the podcast. But Erik, plug your stuff. Let everybody know where they can find you. I don't even know if I mentioned your Twitter handle, so definitely let people know where they can find you and to check out the website and stuff.
Yeah, my spiel I usually give is if you guys are looking for my ratings, my rankings, my projections, my bracketology, I'm out there at haslametrics.com. Otherwise, if you want to find me on Twitter, I'm out there going #analyticallyfinal at Haslametrics is my handle out there.
Yeah, and check out his pinned tweet. He tweeted it like a year ago. It's just a little cheat sheet about the analytical final stuff, which I always find very interesting. And I thought it was interesting too in that thread. Someone asked you, had you ever had games, in your time doing this that have gone analytically final where the projected loser actually comes back and wins it? And it's happened. It's very, very rare, obviously, as you might expect, but it has happened. So I think that's interesting to note too.
It happened twice since I started. Once was that NCAA tournament game between Northern Iowa and Texas A&M, and the other one was the year later in the pit when Nevada went unconscious from three-point land and overcame like a 20-point deficit against New Mexico and won that game. And so it has not happened in, I want to say, maybe over 5 years now.
Wow. So it's been a bit. It's been a little bit. We're maybe with the way this year's been going, we're due for it, I think, Erik. Sometime in the tournament, we'll see. Well, Erik, thank you so much again for coming on. And again, thank you for all of you who have been listening at home, at the gym, your car ride, or wherever you are, or if you're watching the YouTube video. Thank you so much for that as well. Again, subscribe to the channel while you're here too. Give this video a like and share it around, and subscribe to our podcast. Share this with any Vol fans, any SEC basketball fans. I'm sure, this is more of obviously we talked about Tennessee, but this is also one you can kind of get someone interested in to hear about the SEC. Just kind of hear about, kind of the behind the curtain stuff about NCAA tournament stuff as well, and just some analytical talk too. So if you're just a college basketball junkie, I think you'll enjoy this episode. So thank you, Erik. Thank you to all our listeners out there. And signing off for Erik, I'm Nathaniel, and this has been another episode of the Vol Basketball Fever podcast. Thank you for watching Vol Basketball Fever. Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel while you're here. We appreciate all your support, and the show wouldn't be possible without Vol fans like you. Thank you.